morning Tim referred to it, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail. And I'm really going to be looking at three things, if I can get through all of them. When I talk about a co-op economy, I'm not just talking about cooperatives. That's the first thing I should point out. That in my visits to this region and in my sort of understanding of what a co-op economy means, and framework for a co-op economy, it extends beyond simply the co-op sector itself. And in my mind, what's interesting, most interesting about this particular region is how the co-op idea, the co-op model, has migrated outside of the co-op movement itself to have a major impact on the entire structure of the broader economy as well. And so I'm going to be spending a fair bit of time talking about how co-op principles and co-op systems have restructured the capitalist economy as well, which to me is really quite fascinating. So we're talking about the Emilia model originally referred to these manufacturing districts in northern Italy, and how small capitalist firms and medium-sized firms were working together to create very powerful clusters of businesses that were doing phenomenally well in terms of global markets. Right? So that's what the Emilia model originally referred to. But I now refer to it as a model that encompasses the capitalist economy, the co-op economy, and more recently, how the co-op model has really played a major role in transforming social care. Right? So public sector, social care, private sector, the capitalist firms, and the co-op sector itself. All three of them are now, in my mind, included in this conception of a cooperative. Does that make sense? Okay, so I think I'll get through the first two. I'm trying to get through social co-ops as well, but we'll see. This is the region we're talking about, Emilia Romagna, in the northern part of Italy, that sort of middle part. Population, there's about 4 million people. Capital city is Bologna, it's about 500,000 people. There are 20 regions in Italy, this is one of those regions. And these two last figures, the GDP per capita being about 30% above the national average, and it being the second highest performing economic region in Italy, those two figures are still true. What is unclear right now, given what Italy and the rest of the sort of countries in Europe are going through, is what the unemployment rate is, right, and kind of how that's impacting the region. It's been a couple of years since I've actually been there. But traditionally, in really hard economic times, during recessions, for example, in the past, this region has done better, both in terms of employment, in terms of exports, in terms of production generally, than the other regions in Europe. And when I was most involved with this, it's not only the second highest performing economic region in Italy, it's also the 10th highest performing economic region in Europe as a whole. Europe has about 120, 122 economic regions. This region is consistently in the top 10. That's Bologna, the capital city. Of course, a very ancient city. It's also home to the University of Bologna, which is the oldest university in Europe. And one thing that people don't know is that the University of Bologna was one time run like a co-op. The students of the university actually hired the professors, right? And had the final say both in hiring professors, in the curriculum, right? It was really a democratically run university. And of course, it's like you might expect. This is the Via Zamboni. This is the heart of the university district. And it's a very young city and a very old city at the same time. There are students coming here still from all around the world. This is one of the most famous universities in the world. And also has, and this has been very, very important, both for the co-op sector and for the rest of the economic, the sectors of the region, is a faculty of economics at the University of Bologna, which has a particular focus and a specialty in civil economy and cooperative economy. So it's been a source of really important research and the cultivation and exploration and expansion of cooperative culture in the region. So that link between a university that has a focus and developed expertise and theory around co-op economies and co-op culture, and the relationship of that in cultivating and enriching the co-op ethos of the region has been very important. And it's an area that's very rich also in craftsmanship. You see evidence of this everywhere you go, in the public buildings, in the products. Craftsmanship is still a key part of how people think about manufacturing. Manufactura, the original term of manufacturing, means something is made by hand. The outlook of small business owners who have a very personal, very direct connection to of these very high quality products that come from this region. Most of them export to the very highest markets internationally. So we're talking about food. So you think about sort of wine or Parmesan cheese, Parma ham, balsamic vinegar, right? All these products have a standard of excellence and a brand reputation for outstanding quality that are recognized around the world. Virtually all of these products are produced through some kind of a consortium or a cooperative organization composed of the farmers or the producers that create the vinegar or the wine or whatever, and have stringent controls on the quality of what they produce. And that philosophy of quality and craftsmanship runs right through the entire economy, whether we're talking about cheese or whether we're talking about tiles. So many of these products, whether we're talking about like leatherwork, leatherware, are a product not of large industrial firms, but mostly small to medium-sized firms. Most of the firms in the region are about 400,000 businesses in a population of 4 million people. That makes it one enterprise for every 10 people. Most of them are, most of them still are family-owned firms and employ fewer than 10 people. How do they succeed? How do they survive being so small and so specific in what they do, and yet export to buyers in the United States and Canada, all over the world? If you go to China, you'll probably find balsamic vinegar, right? Or Parmesan cheese. Where in the world can you go and not find Parmesan cheese anymore? Right? But Parmesan cheese is still a product of very small dairy farmers that have collaborated through their co-op to create, this wonderful product. So the key elements of this economic system. The way I've interpreted it is like this. It's a product of managed cooperation through three interlocking sectors. The cooperative sector and the social economy, which is all those the nonprofits and the charitable organizations and the volunteer organizations and so on. The public sector, and a key role played by government in making all this work, and the private sector, which is the small and medium-sized firms. So the key that's made this work is the adoption and promotion of a philosophy that sees both economic and social development as being a product of collective effort. So the promotion of economic and social development for at least 40 years has been how to put into play collective solutions to collective problems. Developing a regional economy is a collective problem. Developing the institutional supports that allow small firms to work together in a local industry is not just the problem of an individual firm. It's a collective challenge that has an impact on the entire region. So the understanding and articulation of collective responses to these challenges has been at the foundation of everything, really, that I'm talking about here. And a lot of these solutions, of course, are arrived at through a process of negotiation and management and discussion among key stakeholders that on the face of it may have opposing interests, right? Like business associations on the one hand and unions on the other, right? Like employers and workers, like the private sector and government. But what's evolved in this area is a very interesting, what I think it's almost like a laboratory experiment in cooperation, where you have these, on the surface of it, contrary interests that are finding common solutions. And one of the things that happens is that once you have these kinds of relationships that are established between the public sector and the co-op sector and the capitalist sector, it all becomes very intertwined. The institutions that are established to promote economic development, for example, are institutions that touch every corner of the system. And what I've discovered is that a change in one part of the system has a ripple effect right through the system because of these institutional relationships that have been built up. So these are some of the key factors. Since the Second World War, right after the Second World War, the government that came into power in this region, also the neighboring region of Tuscany, were very strong socialist governments. They had a deep history of socialist and communitarian politics. They were actively involved in fighting against Mussolini and the fascists. And when the war was over, they took control in a number of these regions, Emilia Romagna being one of the key regions. It was called, still is called, the Red Belt in Italy. So from the beginning, there was a very activist government which promoted the co-op idea. And what ended up happening was a very close association between the regional government and the cooperative movement. There were high levels of what we call social capital. The tradition and history of cooperation had been established for a long, long time in this region. And part of it was actually a consequence of the way they organized their agricultural economy. It was a sharecropping, rather a tenant farmer system, where landowners would have tenant farmers that would share produce with them as well, share it amongst themselves. But it was a land tenure and agricultural system that established the foundations for cooperation between landowners, for example, and farmers, workers, laborers on the farm. The other factor, which was really interesting, is that through this region runs the Po River, and it is absolutely fundamental for irrigating the agriculture of the area. The only way agriculture could work in the region was if farmers and landowners all down and up the river actually collaborated and cooperated to manage the water systems, the irrigation systems in the Po River, so that they could all farm. So these roots of cooperation were very deep and preceded, really, the emergence of the co-op model itself. The other factors were technology was adapted to be used by very small, very specialized firms. So it wasn't large factory systems, assembly line systems, that kind of technology that was used, but rather very precise technology that was adaptable for use in small workplaces. And this was a key part of what enabled these small firms to be very good at what they do, to be very specialized in what they do, and also to use the technology to adapt to changes in their markets, right? So that kind of technology was really important. High levels of entrepreneurial skill, and then the braiding of cooperation and competition. So these firms, although they are in the same sector, and although they may be competitors trying to get their products to international markets, have learned to both compete and cooperate in ways that make them stronger. The cooperative economy itself. There are about 8,000 co-ops in Emilia Romagna. They account for about a third of the region's GDP, which is huge. In fact, the largest of the enterprises in Emilia Romagna are typically co-ops. About 3 in 4 Bolognese belong to a co-op of some kind. And it's probably the highest per capita density of co-ops in Europe. The co-op movement has had a long history, as I said, and it's been a very interesting legacy of how the co-op system has evolved in this area. You have co-op federations that really, in a sense, are the institutional supports. What was being mentioned this morning, for example, about how institutional supports are so important for co-op development. In this region, you had 3 primary federations for the co-ops. And each of these 3 federations belonged to a different political tradition. So the Lega is the largest of the federations, the first of the co-op federations to be established. But it has socialist tradition. They were aligned with the Communist Party and then the Social Democratic Party. So they were the left wing of the political spectrum in Emilia Romagna. Cooperativa was kind of on the right wing. They were associated with the Christian Democratic Party, with the Catholic tradition, and actually the second largest and the second of the federations to be organized. And then you have ACCI, which is in the Republican tradition. So very different political traditions and political divides, in the region. And along each of these lines, you had a separate federation that federated all the co-ops that were aligned along that political line. And what's also interesting is that this kind of political division is replicated right through the other parts of the system. So the union movement, labor, for example, has the same configuration. There's the left, there's the middle, there's the right, and each of them have their own collection of unions that are associated with each of those political traditions. This has changed in the last 15 years. These political divisions were quite clear and quite distinct. But what's happened in the last 15 or 20 years is that they've sort of begun to merge. So the red of the left, the Lega, and the white of the right of the Catholic has sort of merged together to become kind of a pink, hue to the system. They each have their own federation still, but those political distinctions are much less important today than they used to be. And these are the key sectors in the co-op system. The consumer co-ops are among the largest in Europe. They are the largest distributors, for example, of food and household housewares in Italy. Agriculture is still a key part of where co-ops play a major role. Construction, a lot of the earliest co-ops that were established were brought into being really by labor co-ops that were hired by government to go out and clear swamps, do public works, and so on. So some of the very earliest co-ops in Italy were actually involved in the construction sector. Today, the construction and engineering co-ops in Italy are among the largest firms of their type in Europe. Transport, manufacturing, unlike here and in Canada, where manufacturing is actually not a big sector for cooperatives. Most of the co-ops here are agricultural co-ops or sometimes consumer co-ops, not so manufacturing. But here, manufacturing co-ops are quite large, and I'll be going into detail in one of them. Many of them are worker co-ops. Arts and culture, and then the last one, social services. Social services is a big part of what's happening today in the evolution of the co-op movement in Italy. And it's the newest, really, of the formal sectors to be established in the system. This is a shot of one of the consumer co-ops. Ypres Co-op is really a brand name for co-op, which is really the name of the consumer co-op. They were the first people to actually introduce large-scale retail outlets in Italy. Traditionally, Italians have shopped at small, shops in their local community, and that is still true among all of the countries in Europe. Italians still like to shop on a very small scale, day-to-day shopping, so to speak. But it was the co-op system that introduced large-scale retail outlets. And like the malls were established by the co-ops. So if you go to a mall, a large mall like this, chances are, like Tim was saying, in the Basque region in Spain, that it's actually built, developed, operated by a co-op. The consumer co-op has about 2,000 brand items that they sell with a co-op label on them. They have very, very high standards, stringent control standards for the quality of the products that they sell. And they have also established a really important link with their members. I use this slide to illustrate this point because when the mad cow epidemic broke out, you remember, in Europe, it was about 10 years ago, meat sales in Italy plummeted overnight by about 30% in all the other supermarkets and meat outlets. In the co-op stores, the drop in meat purchasing from among members was about 5% compared to 30. Right? So that tells us something. It tells us that something special has been cultivated between the co-op system and their membership. The level of trust remains very, very high, even around something like tainted meat products. So one of the lessons that was taken from this was the importance of sustaining and cultivating that member trust and member loyalty. And one of the things that's been a challenge for an organization like this, I think there's about 7 million members, 7.8 million members that belong to this consumer co-op. How do you sustain a democratic and cooperative culture in an organization of that size? And this is something that they've been working on. And one of the ways that they've done that is by decentralizing governance. And so what's happened now is that for each of those stores, you'll have a council of members, composed of members, that actually meets and deliberates on how they're going to be using the surplus that's generated from that store for community projects. So members have a very active role in defining, what is the relationship of that co-op to the community, and how do they use the money that's generated as a surplus from that co-op to support their members and to support community at a local level. So that's the food system. And I just sort of pass it by very quickly, but it is really a monolith, in the co-op system in Italy. Arts and culture is another area where co-ops are very important. Emilia Romagna has the highest per capita investment in arts and culture in Italy. This is the Arena del Sole, which is a theater, a very old theater in Bologna. It is operated as a co-op. And it's a very popular theater still, and actually the members of the co-op are the technicians, the light people, the sound people, the set designers, and all that kind of stuff that actually launch and mount these plays in the Arena del Sole. And then when we look at manufacturing, one of the, probably the best example that I provide in terms of giving you a sort of a sense of the scale of these co-ops is SACME. SACME started off just after the war with a group of 11 unemployed iron workers. And they came together and they started producing small, we also worked in gas and appliances and so on. But very quickly they shifted to tile production and machines for the ceramics industry. Today, SACME is a global, international cooperative. There are about 340, 360 members that live and work in Imola, which is that little town that Tim pointed out to this morning. But they also employ a much larger workforce that are not yet members. And they operate in probably 18 or 19 countries around the world. So they are a global co-op, still managed and directed by about, say 400 worker members in the small town of Imola. There is a waiting list to become a member, and the cost of becoming a member of SACME is in the order of $170,000 to $180,000. So if you want to be a member, you can join. After a period of probationary time, you have to be nominated by your fellow employees, and to purchase the shares to join the co-op, if you don't have $170,000 to $180,000 handy, the co-op will basically provide you with a program of about 15 years where you're paying off your shares through a salary reduction over the course of that time. What's interesting about this system is when you leave the co-op, you get that money back, plus interest. And while you're a member of the co-op, you receive an additional dividend, right? A member dividend. That's one of the benefits of the membership. But what it does is two things that are really interesting. One, it provides operating capital for the co-op. The co-op's money comes from its membership. they don't owe money to banks. And this is very typical of the most successful of these co-ops, is that they don't have a lot of debt from banks. They get most of their money from their membership. Secondly, a portion of this money goes into what's called an indivisible reserve. And that reserve is not distributed to members. And it's one of the sources of growth capital that SACME has used over the years to expand to a global operation. Up until about 15 years ago, they were basically still operating in Italy. But they'd accumulated over these years this enormous amount of reserve capital from these kind of memberships that they then started to put into investment, and they started buying up, firms all over the world, in Singapore and Brazil and Canada and the United States and so on. But it's largely a self-financed system. So, are there any questions? Yes.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Are the workers in countries other than Spain worker owners as well, or only this?
You mean other than Italy?
Italy. I had those in Montreal.
No. Those firms, if they start off as conventional capitalist firms, they continue to operate in that way. I understand that they are now considering introducing cooperative governance systems in some of their firms, but by and large, what they have done is if they buy a firm, it continues to operate in the way that it was when it was bought. Yes?
Do they have a continuing legislative protectionist agenda like your standard corporations do? I mean,
how do you mean?
Well, most corporations go along and they lobby to get laws passed, and
right.
Protectionism
right.
still affect the whole entire global community
right.
by their methods to protect their own industry.
Yeah.
Like you said, they buy up U.S. corporations, Canadian corporations, and put them out of business.
Right.
So,
there's no question. I mean, the co-ops have worked very, very hard to protect their interests. There's no question about it. They lobby for policies and legislation that benefits their members and benefits the co-ops. And they have to. I mean, they have done very well by government up until recently. In fact, co-ops are recognized and protected in the Constitution, in Italy's Constitution, partly because that Constitution was written by some major co-op leaders, right? When Italy was first unified in the later 1800s, right? So co-ops are in the Constitution with protection. But when Berlusconi came to power, one of his first targets was the co-op system. He understood that a big part of his political opposition was in those co-ops. So he started undermining their autonomy, he started undermining and attacking the legislation that protected their status and so on and so on. So what's happened is that there are now certain restrictions, especially on large co-ops, manufacturing co-ops like SACME, that constrains them to do business with over 50% being their members in order for them to have the protected status they have in the legislation. If they do not do over 50% of the business with members, they are not protected, in the tax code and so on. Right? So it's had that impact. Berlusconi had that impact. But that took a major battle to get that compromise. When Berlusconi came in and started tampering with the co-op legislation, the largest demonstration in Italy since the end of the Second World War descended on Rome. 1 million people descended on Rome. 1 million people, right? And fought back, the proposed changes to the legislation. So you had to compromise.
Did they deal with the lobbying co-op?
Sorry?
Did they deal with the lobbying co-op?
The lobbying co-op.
Lobbying co-op, yeah.
Maybe. That's a good point. Good point. Probably there was. I wouldn't be surprised. Right? So no, those protections are fragile.
Yeah.
Right? And they had to be very vigilant and massive organizing effort to get those people to fight back. Part of the effort, of course, was supported by Cooperativa. No, I forget the name of it. It's the national corporate lobbying. Confindustria. Yes, thank you very much. Confindustria is basically a trade association for the largest of the private firms in Italy. Big supporters of Berlusconi. And so they, for years, have been railing against the privileges of co-ops and so on. But very interestingly, in this region, in Emilia Romagna, Confindustria has found an accommodation with the co-op system. I actually interviewed for a film the head of Confindustria in Emilia Romagna, and I was asking him, "What's your feeling about co-ops?" And there was no way that he could actually come out and say, you know, I don't even think he dislikes co-ops. He recognizes that they are the backbone of that economy. So his organization has come to an accommodation with the co-op movement in Italy, in Emilia Romagna. But outside of Emilia Romagna, in Tuscany, and the rest of the country, Confindustria are just, you know, ruthless. Anyway, back to Emilia Romagna. Capitalist economy, as I said, is about 400,000 small firms, one for every 10 people, and it's organized along sectoral and geographic lines. So one of the really distinguishing features of this area, as I said, is you have large numbers of small and medium-sized firms that are concentrated around specific towns. And these towns specialize in a particular product. It might be ceramic tiles, it might be footwear, it might be knitwear, right? But the logic of the system is how to organize all of these small firms that are working in the same markets or in the same industries so that they actually strengthen each other through cooperation. Those are some of the, there's Confindustria there, those are some of the key business associations in the region. This Confederazione Nazionale Artigianati, the CNA, is an organization, a trade association of small firms, but very radical. It's a business association, but it was on the streets with all those other folks when they marched on Rome, for example. The Association of Small Businesses, the Chambers of Commerce, and so on. Chambers of Commerce. I once took a delegation to a meeting with the Bologna Chamber of Commerce. And I asked them, I said, what is your view of the role of government in the economy? And the response was immediate. They said, if it were not for the support of the regional government, we would not have a successful economic region in this area. The role of government is absolutely indispensable to the support and to the success of small firms. That's from the Bologna Chamber of Commerce. Right? So what I'm getting at is that the whole attitude around what economic development means and what is the role of the public interest through government in economic development is at 180 degrees opposite to what you would find if you were to ask that same question from the head of the Chamber of Commerce, right, of almost any major American city. So these are the key features of the Emilian model. Small firms operating in production networks, cluster model based in industrial districts, and there's a broad-based supportive infrastructure. Just like the cooperatives have their federations, which provide them with support, all kinds of support. Lobbying support around government relations, technical assistance if they run into trouble, access to capital if they need to invest, to grow, to do research and development, mediation support. They provide business back office services like payroll, bookkeeping and accounting services. They provide advice to their members on workplace safety programs, meeting environmental standards, just a whole range of things that any business, whether it's a co-op or a private enterprise, has to deal with to operate. The federations, the co-op federations, provide those services to their member co-ops, and these businesses get those same kinds of services from the CNA, from API, and so on, and the Chamber of Commerce. So even in those, in that capitalist sector, you have a collaborative, cooperative system of institutions that provide them, for example, the Bologna Chamber of Commerce. For the firms that operate in and around the district of Bologna, they do market analyses of the major sectors in countries outside of Europe to allow those firms that are operating in packaging, in services, in manufacturing, to develop relationships and export their products with the kind of market intelligence that they receive from the Chamber of Commerce. Right? Yes.
So those larger trade associations, consortiums, they are sort of taking that, almost that corporate role of
Yes.
centralizing then all those and drawing all the products from all the smaller cooperatives
Yes.
and helping them distribute it themselves.
No, play that back to me again.
Well, letting the smaller cooperatives
Right.
distribute it through the relationships that they've developed.
Yeah, but in this case, what I was talking about is private firms, not co-ops.
Oh, okay.
I'm talking here about small and medium-sized conventional companies, right? The Chamber of Commerce, the Association of Small Industries, right? Provide those kinds of shared services to those companies, just like the federations do for the co-ops.
Okay.
That's what I was saying, right? So you have this kind of mirror image, right, of shared systems, institutionalized through these organizations to provide support to their members, whether they're a co-op on the one hand, or whether they're a private company on the other. So what you really have is an adaptation of the co-op model for two very different kinds of, enterprise models, right? Yes?
You know, it comes to mind with an organization that's protracted, how do they respond in a timely manner to the economic influx of prices going up and down? If the organization establishes a trade price,
Right.
and the world economic money supply takes a spike,
Right.
and how responsive does it take this organization to respond in a manner that protects all of the co-op members in
Okay.
order to keep the prices?
All right. Now, no, there's a misunderstanding there. The organization doesn't establish a trade price. Those trade prices are established by the individual co-ops or the individual enterprises when they do a deal. What the organization provides them with is information, market connections, market intelligence, shared services, right? But the organization does not sell their products for them, right? They are responsible for doing the deal, and they're the ones that work out in a regular market way what the price is going to be for their product.
Gotcha.
Right?
Nothing stands as an industry standard. It's just
No, except in the case of cooperative products, like Parmesan cheese, right? Or Parma ham, right? Those co-op consortia, whose members are those dairy farmers, will in fact market that product for their members internationally, like a marketing board might, for example, right? But that only applies to the members of that particular consortium, right? Are we clear so far? Is that kind of... Okay. This is the cluster model this is the traditional Emilian model of enterprises collaborating. Typically, you would have an anchor firm, very often a design firm. This is, for example, in the knitwear industry. knitwear, the town of Carpi has traditionally been a center for knitwear. One of the largest producers of high-end knitwear in Europe was these small firms in Carpi. So you would have a design firm. They would get a contract with a particular buyer, and then what they would then do for that product is subcontract it out to a variety of other small firms that specialized in some portion of the production process, right? So some firms would specialize, for example, in dyeing, others in cutting, others perhaps in marketing, right? Assembly, embroidery, and so on. So those firms became very, very good at very specialized operations within the production cycle, right? And then what the cluster system allowed was for them to continue doing what they did, but as part of a larger production process that at the other end produced an Armani suit, for example. And when I say Armani suits, I'm not just using that as a symbol. Prada, Armani, Gucci, Versace, all the big name designers brought a lot of their products from this region, from Emilia Romagna, because of the flexibility of the firms, because of the high level of skill, right? Now what's happened is the system has changed. And these, at one time, one of these anchor firms, for example, had a contract. They became the anchor firm for particular production of sweaters, say. In another cycle, it might be this firm that would be the lead, that would subcontract to the rest, right? So there was a revolving leadership that took place within these clusters of one firm, followed by another firm, followed by a third firm, and so on. But what's happened in the last decade is that these firms have, in a sense, stabilized and become the leaders for a particular manufacturing district. So they've become to dominate that production process. They've been able to accumulate, gather together the technical skills and the capital and the knowledge that's needed for them to be able to compete successfully with, because the retail industry, the knitwear industry and so on has undergone a revolution, in the last 10, 15 years. And so what's happened is a kind of a rationalization, right, of this cluster model, where the emergence of sort of key firms and then satellite firms around.
Is there any ownership, shared ownership model in that, or is it?
No, these are individual firms. It's owned by A, that's owned by B, that's owned by C, and then they collectively work together to produce whatever product they're producing. What is interesting, what they do own together are, what I'm coming to next is service centers. Shared service centers. Okay, so that's pretty clear? Yes?
One question, how is this different from an American large firm subcontracting particular kinds of specialties?
Right. And it's the same basic idea. I think what's different here is the scale, the size. Most of these firms are not very large. So, when this originally began, the relationship among these firms was much more egalitarian, right, on an equal standard, than what you would normally find with a major buyer, for example, in the subcontracted firms in the North American model, and also smaller scale.
So did what happened for an anchor firm to become a key firm? I mean, did they all want that to happen, or was it agglomeration of power by one outfit?
It's probably a combination of the two. There was a recognition that the ability to collect expertise, to collect capital, right, was seen as just an important competitive asset. And so
for everybody.
Everybody recognized that was true. And so I think it was just a natural evolution of the cluster model to adapt to changing circumstances. And when they were having to deal, for example, with major competition from China, from the Philippines and so on for knitwear, one of the things they had to do was extend, right, their capacity to organize materials, organize labor, and then follow a product through from its original design right through to its delivery, you know, through a retail spot in wherever it was sold. And so that all that process required a certain centralization of skills.
So up to that time, they did hold their own against international corporations.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So it's the government businesses like China that.
It's not just government businesses. It's just that the level of competition, especially for example around labor. You know, I mean, if you're able to access labor at a fraction of the cost to produce a product that's pretty close in quality to something that's produced in Italy, you've got a problem. The knitwear industry in and around Carpi has undergone a complete changeover. And in fact, some of the traditional industries in Italy have, you know, actually, there's nothing left of them. They've had to be replaced with other kinds of industries. But anyway, coming back to the point, there was an evolution of the model so that it became more effective to be able to have an ongoing relationship with external markets by stabilized firms that had contracts, that had long-term relationships with buyers, and that made more sense than for them to become the lead firms, the anchor firms, on an ongoing basis. Right?
Specialization.
Yes. So, I want to talk a little bit about the regional government and what it did. As I said, a key player in economic development in this region has been the regional government. And up until very recently, there was unbroken succession of left-wing governments in the region. And one of the things that they did, this is about 30 years ago, 25, 30 years ago, is how do we develop a long-term strategy for raising up the economic capacity of this region? About 40 years ago, Emilia Romagna was at the bottom of the region's economically performing in Italy. In the course of 35, 40 years, they've gone to the top. And one of the reasons is because of the role of the government. They set out to do a detailed analysis of what were the strengths and what were the weaknesses of the companies operating in Emilia Romagna. They identified something like 7 or 8 key sectors where there was a history of expertise in the region that included fashion, knitwear, footwear, ceramics, agricultural production, agricultural machinery. And then what they started doing was organize service centers, funded in part by government, and then funded in part by those companies in those sectors. And those service centers then began to provide shared services to the companies in that industry. This is one example. No, I don't have the example. I'll have to describe it to you. In the town of Carpi, knitwear, an organization called CITER, C-I-T-E-R. It's basically an industry, textile industry service center. Its members are all those small knitwear factories that are sprinkled through that area. And what CITER would provide, for example, is market information. They would send agents to the trade shows, the fashion shows in Tokyo, in Milan, in New York, right? And get all the information on what are the fabrics and the fashions and the colors and the textiles and so on that are going to be in the upcoming season for fashion. And they would take all that information and they would bring it back compile it into a book, and then that would then become available to all the members of the shared service organization. So those small firms no longer had to worry about sending one of their people to Milan or Tokyo or New York to find out what they should be planning for in terms of the next fashion cycle. That was done on their behalf by the shared service organization. It also provided them with training. It provided them, as I said earlier, with payroll, bookkeeping, and the other kind of back office functions that all these tax, avoidance. How do you do that for their members? And that was a crucial element in helping these small firms slowly become more and more competitive and rise up, kind of the ladder of performance. So for footwear, for knitwear, for ceramics, and so on. What's happened now in the last 10 years is that all of these formerly government-supported shared service organizations have been privatized. They are now owned by the private sector, by those companies that use them. So they've been handed over. So that's good and bad. On the one hand, the model has been adopted and sort of taken over by the private sector. On the other hand, the role of government in providing that kind of global view, right, of where does this region need to go economically, what are our challenges collectively, what are our strengths collectively, how do we build on those? That role of government is diminishing. And I think that's part of the drift, right? Part of the temper of the times. So kind of the small is better for government, the kind of neoliberal view of the role of government in markets has actually had an impact on this region as well.
So have those service centers become cooperatively owned by those businesses that were using their services?
They're jointly owned by those businesses. Yes. In effect, yes. They've been privatized, but they still have membership, and they're still controlled by those businesses that use their services. Yes.
Do you happen to know when these services started, if the governments, how they got buy-in, how they convinced these businesses that they needed their services?
Right. That's a great question. If you were to try the same thing here, you'd have a tough sell to do it. Not just here, but in Canada as well. It helped enormously that there was such a tradition of cooperation in the region before. Right? I mean, the fact that there are 8,000 cooperatives already operating in Emilia Romagna, right? Where everybody has somebody that works in a co-op, was an enormous asset to the social capital and the relational capital that existed between firms. Right? So that culture of cooperation was already in place, right? And so when the government said, okay, let's look at ways we can share services to help small firms compete, there was already a familiarity with that concept and a history with it, right? A lot of it owed to the co-op movement, right? And that's why it was much more easy to do it in Emilia Romagna than it would be elsewhere. No doubt. Yes?
How much TV do these people watch?
Why?
It's a big, that's what we're here for, is to see how to implement the co-op process. This is already modeled in the minds of men for millennia, and we're in a situation where we have a TV society,
Right.
and the capitalists dictate the
Right.
information that we're receiving.
Have you ever watched Italian television?
No.
Well, there's no other television like it on the planet. I can assure you that. It is bizarro television. But you do have a very distinctive political and social culture in Emilia Romagna and in Tuscany, in the region just below it. It is a culture and it is a political economy that has emerged out of decades of struggle, political struggle. First, the land reform movement. Thank you. The land reform movement, and then the effort to dispel the fascists. Mussolini was born in Forlì, which is about 40 minutes northeast of Bologna. So you had in this region, it was a region of extremes, right? You had the communists on the one hand, and you had the fascists on the other. And so the emergence of this kind of solidarity culture is a product of the political fights that went on over the course just before and after the Second World War. And so it's not an accident that this kind of proactive, solidaristic, socially minded communitarian outlook has evolved. In large measure because the government that was established in Emilia Romagna right after the Second World War looked at the world that way. This would not have happened, would not have been possible without a very determined, a very long-sighted government that was promoting it. Something else that's interesting. The Communist Party in Italy was the largest communist party in Europe, right? Millions and millions of members. It was a weird party. It was unusual in a lot of ways. One of the ways in which it was unusual is they did not reject the market, right? The kind of conventional orthodox view of socialism is the market's an evil thing. We don't want anything to do with businesses, right? We're just concerned about labor. We're just concerned about workers. Employers and bosses are all bad, right? That's the orthodox view. That was never the view that was taken by the leaders of the Communist Party in Emilia Romagna. They recognized they needed to get the small business owners on side. And so they developed these kinds of programs, right? The shared service programs and so on to support small enterprise because they saw it as being indispensable to the kind of economy they wanted to develop. And so co-ops were part of that, right? But they weren't the only part of that. And so when they went along this path to develop this kind of inclusive notion of sort of market socialism, really, is what it was, they got a lot of flack from the Communist Party in Rome, which had a very kind of orthodox view of it, right? And when they were challenged by Rome, and when they were actually demanding of the workers that worked in these co-ops, for example, to choose between co-ops and that kind of market view of economics and the party view in Rome, they got back a very clear response, which was, if I have to choose between my co-op and the party, it's the party card I'm going to tear up. Right? So the co-op tradition and the history of the co-op movement was an enormous stabilizing factor in the evolution of what political economy should look like in this region. And it was a bridge, really, between socialist ideals in terms of solidarity, right? Economic equity, worker control, and so on, and the market, which enabled this transition and this sharing of purpose with small business owners and employers. Because co-ops are already in the market. They already, deal with enterprise and business and markets in a way that orthodox sort of communist thinking really does not. They never accepted that socialism meant state socialism, state control, right? Socialism in Emilia Romagna was always civil socialism. The regional government supported it, was a partner in it, but never really controlled it. Okay? So, the result is, you have a very unique animal in Emilia Romagna. A vibrant, very successful cooperative economy, formed like the strict sense, and a larger cooperative economy that includes private sector and government as partners. And in fact, what's happened, these firms, now, when I was originally sort of working on this stuff, the co-ops in Italy were successful. They were pretty well known, but they were still sort of on the margins. What's happened in the last 10 to 12 years is they have now emerged to become some of the largest and most highly profiled firms in Italy. The construction firms, the engineering firms. They are now among the insurance firms. Co-ops, all of them, are among the largest firms in Italy, among the best known firms in Italy, real leaders in the Italian economy. That has only emerged in the last 10 to 12 years. Yes?
Yeah, I'm curious, to the extent that you're familiar with the cooperative movement in Trentino,
Right.
If you could compare the trajectory of Trentino versus Emilia Romagna, you might be able to background
Right.
on that if you can.
I know Trentino less well, but Trentino, actually, interestingly, Trentino has an even higher concentration of co-ops per capita than Emilia Romagna does. But it's a different tradition. It's a higher percentage of those firms are actually in the agricultural sector in Trentino. They also have, I think, a kind of a more hybrid understanding of what co-ops can be. So I visited a number of co-ops in Trentino that are kind of a hybrid model, kind of a semi-capitalist, semi-co-op structure, where, for example, they have lots of outside investors. They issue share capital to non-members. They too have global operations, but they themselves see themselves as being a breed apart from the more sort of social democratic cooperatives in Emilia Romagna. There's a different political tradition in Trentino as well. Yes, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. For the role of the government, there's investments, there's regulation, but do they sit on the boards?
Yes.
They do sit on the
Yes.
boards of co-ops?
No, not on co-ops. I thought you talked about the shared service. No, they don't.
Okay, because some countries they do.
Oh, I know. I know. No, there has been traditionally, up until about 15 years ago, a very cozy, close relationship between the co-ops of a particular political tradition and that party, right? I mean, they know each other intimately well. They were part of the same political struggles. They grew up together. They went to the same schools together. One of them ended up in the party. Another one ended up as the head of a dairy co-op, for example. So, so there was a very close political alliance on the left and on the right. Okay, but they never formally were able to sort of designate who the president or who the chair of a particular co-op is going to be. Those political links have really dissolved over the last 15 years. Yes?
How does the University of Bologna Economics Department teach or support the
Right.
cooperatives? Do they teach a program there?
They do. They do. There's a master's in civil economy in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Bologna. The man that runs that program is a personal... Zamani, right. Stefano Zamani. I'm going to write this down for you. It's the only name I'm going to write down for you. It's someone you need to know. And two people. Stefano Zamani is an economics professor at the University of Bologna. He started up and he has been running the Masters in Cooperative and Civil Economy. That program is funded by the co-ops in Italy, not just in Emilia Romagna. It's a national center for co-op studies. And the purpose of the program at the university, in Zamani's own words, was to cultivate and perpetuate a cooperative culture in the co-op firms themselves, right? So it's an economics program, but it focuses on cooperative economics. It focuses on what is it that makes co-ops co-ops. Why do they operate in the way they do? What's their economic DNA? So he is an economic theorist. He's probably the foremost cooperative theorist in the world, Zamani. So if you look him up, there's all kinds of his publications you can find online, right? 1 minute, okay. His wife is named Vera. And she also is an economist. Both of them had studied at Oxford, where they met. But Vera Zamani is an economic historian. She is probably, she was without question the most important historian of the cooperative movement in Italy, right? So she's written numerous books on the history of the co-op movement in Italy. And whenever they appear together, she's always the one that corrects them on this case. But he's a far better cook than she is. I didn't get a chance to talk about social co-ops. I'm just going to say 2 words about it, and then the fastest growing segment of the cooperative movement in Italy today is the provision of social care. About 17, 18 years ago, in the last austerity program that was used in Italy, a lot of the public service hiring was stopped, and there was also a lot of discontent with the way services were delivered. So social co-ops started being established, where caregivers and families that used formerly public social care services started organizing social co-ops. And most of these social co-ops were really partnerships between caregivers and the families that use those services. Today, there's probably close to 9,000 social co-ops in Italy. And they provide everything from health care to care for people with disabilities to recovery programs for people that are addicted to drugs to training programs for formerly incarcerated individuals, former prisoners, right? They are really a huge success story. In the course of their work, they've transformed an understanding of what social care is and how it can be organized. So government and the public sector in Italy still has a role to provide funding for public services, but these social co-ops have vastly increased the range of social care that's available. And they are funded from a variety of streams, from government subsidies on the one hand to people receiving those services, to fee-for-service programs for individuals to pay on their ability to pay for services. And many of them actually sell services and products on the market. So they have an entrepreneurial revenue stream as well, right? In the city of Bologna, over 87% of the social care that's provided to the citizens of Bologna are provided under contract of social co-ops. And it's the municipality that, you know, establishes the contractual services with the social co-ops. Again, adult education, you know, a whole range of programs for young people, for homeless, and so on. But it's an astonishing figure when you think of it. When you have a public service program funded by, you know, taxpayer money, but over 87% of those services are actually delivered by the people that work in those services and by the families that use them, actually own and operate those programs. It's an amazing model. Anyway, so I'll just kind of leave it at that.